Hey, this is Ihab. In this video, I am going to talk about selection tools in Photoshop. There are various ways of making selections. There are also features about the selections that can be made during or after the selections that you should definitely be aware of. And you want to keep in mind that you need to know about as much as all of the selection tools, because for every case, there is the right way of making a selection, or there is a more efficient way of making a selection. So you can literally just use the lasso tool and then you just make the selection that you want, and you can claim that this is the right way, and you can pretty much do all sort of selection using the lasso tool. But you should never do that, because there are cases where the lasso tool could take you minutes, hours, and maybe days, as opposed to just making a selection using, for instance, the magic wand that's going to select everything in that range. So before I show you some examples using a thumbnail template that I have here, I'm just going to stick to a black layer. So I would talk about the selection in abstract, and we can stay focused on what's going on, especially that we can see the selection really easily. The first tool I want to talk about is the marquee tool. Shortcut is M. If you click and hold Shift and then hit M again, you can see I am toggling through the other types of selection. So if you click and hold on this button here, and then you go into the second one, which is an ellipse, you can hit Shift, it would make it a circle. If you go into the rectangular and then you can hit Shift, it becomes a square. You can also go to the other ones, such as this one here, and what's making is actually a very slim selection, which is ideal for making like a line. So technically you can just click anywhere you want, right? And then control backspace, which is my B color here, and then control D to deselect, and now I have a line. You can fill it with any color you want, really. So going back to the marquee rectangular tool, if you make a selection, let's say in the process you just realize that you kind of started on the wrong foot, I should say. If you hit click and hold spacebar, it's going to allow you to move that selection. Now, after you make the selection, if you hit click and hold Alt, you can see that on the cursor that there is a minus icon. So now I can deduct or subtract some of that selection. In the meantime, if you click and hold Shift, it's going to add to that selection. And then you hit Control Backspace. That's my masterpiece. The other form of selection would be the lasso tool. And if you click and hold, you get to see other types of lasso. So for that, I'm going to go and demonstrate on the thumbnails. So let's say, for instance, in the case here, I have all of these merged as just one image. So when Photoshop makes a selection, it can see all of these shades that I have, right? So it's not like layers. So if I were to go to the lasso tool, you can just draw that selection by hand, especially if you have the pen or like a Cintiq or Wacom, whatever that is, then it would be a lot easier, which I don't have right now. But you can see that it's not really the ideal way of making a selection here, right? So you can try the following. You can go into the polygonal. So in this case, with the polygonal, you can say, click with the left mouse button and it would just go into straight line. And if I double click, that's gonna connect it with the end, like let's say here. So now you have this, but it's not exactly accurate. So I'm going to try the third type of the lasso tool, which is the magnetic, which is really interesting. So in the process of using the magnetic lasso tool, you start by left mouse button and it would just continue on making the selection. And I'm gonna zoom in just to show you how it's actually working. Like the mouse is slightly far from it, and sometimes the mouse could drift far away. It would still try to manage its best, but you can see it sort of like went off, right? And keep in mind that you can, at any moment, you can click space and move around, right? But if you happen to kind of create some bad points, you can just hit the backspace over and over and over to backtrack those points to the point that you feel like, oh, okay, so this is the point where I want to start over that selection. So it's very comfortable. You can just have the mouse hover around those edges really easily without really worrying about click, click, click. That's going to take you forever. Like for instance, here I made a mistake. If I need to really be accurate with this, I can hit backspace and then hover over again. And then the other thing you want to keep in mind is that there are always some features at the top here where you can change to influence or change the way the selection is made. So in this case here, I'm gonna hit escape to cancel that selection. In this case, I am not gonna be using, actually, if I wanna make the selection, I'm not gonna be using any of those tools. Instead, I'm gonna be using the magic wand. The magic wand is right here. So if you click and hold, there are different types. There's this one that I don't really use, but I'll leave it up to you to do the research for it. The ones that I really like are this one that sort of like continuously just selects, like let's say I want to select here, right? It would just make the selection right away based on the contingency of the colors or the shades. So in this case here, I'm gonna click and hold Control D, and I'm gonna go into the brush again and just make one click, and you will see that it's detecting all of those shades that are actually connected to it. If I go and click here, it's just gonna make all of these selected. So I'm just gonna go and fill those with white just to see the shapes that it has created. Now here's the thing. Let's say you already made those selections and it has included this for you, which you really didn't want. So you can click Alt and it's going to deselect that region, and then Control Backspace. Okay, that looks better. So you go here again and make sure that this is not selected, and then Alt. You can see that's kind of going off a little bit. So for that reason, you might wanna go with the other magic wand tool, which is gonna be this one. I really like it because it goes step by step and it allows you to go here and change the tolerance. So with this one, you would have to continuously click and hold Shift if you want to add to that selection. So while holding Shift, I'm just gonna go to the other points that have different shades outside the region of that tolerance. The higher the tolerance, the more shades it would select for you, which means that it's just gonna go crazy sometimes. So that's why I would like to be more on the conservative side of making that selection to be kind of going bit by bit, especially in a case where I have a tree like this where I need to make sure that it's not gonna select irrelevant things. Another example for using that magic wand would be something like this. You just click and basically it makes that selection for you. Almost perfect, right? You can just go here and say, well, Shift and add this to the selection, Shift and add this to the selection. And the default tolerance, I believe, is 32. So I'm going with lower than the usual. So if you go here, for instance, you go and I can click Shift, so it would keep adding to the previous selection here, but I can just left mouse button. And you can see it's kind of relatively clean. It's always important to go and investigate. But for something like this, it's still not picking up right. So that's why I would just go with 10 or 15. Try that. Click. The back side of it is actually the checker. It's almost difficult to see. So I'm gonna hit Control D to deselect, and then I'm gonna create a new layer, and then I'm gonna color that layer with black. And now I go to this layer just to show you that selection properly. Another thing I want to talk about here is that after you make a selection, one tool that I want to make sure that you keep in mind is the, let's say I really like this mountain. It's not even picking it up. That's actually really interesting. I feel like I'm just imagining that mountain. So I'm gonna go to the magic wand and reduce this to maybe 5, tolerance of 5. That would be really narrow. and now you can see it's picking it up more easily. So let's say I go into this mountain, hit W, and then select it. Let's say I want to skin this out and put it on a completely separate layer, right? So if I hit Control, Shift, and then J, that's gonna put it on a separate layer. So it's a good shortcut to learn. In a case like this where the shades are not consistent and they're kind of messy, let's say I want to select all the materials that have, for instance, this kind of shade. So it's not like a kind of a local selection. I want a selection that selects this depth along with anything else that is similar to it. For that case, you would go into Select. So after you select on color range, it would give you that color picker. So I can select here, for instance, and say like, okay, so this is the color, the black color that I want. Or you can just go here and you can see it's sort of like creating that kind of interesting shape. And that's basically, it's showing you those shades that are shared in that image. The higher you push the fuzziness, the more tolerance is going to give you, meaning that it's going to select more of the neighboring shade or the similar shades. If you go really, really, really strict about the fuzziness, then it would just select very, very little pieces that are similar. So I find the color range to be really good to use. When you have a case, for instance, let's say someone with blue hair, right? And you don't want to go and pick like every piece of hair, but you know that it's blue and the background is very different. So it's going to pick the selection not based on you going specifically to every piece of hair, but rather to just say, I want the color blue or color red or this shade. And then based on the fuzziness, it's going to allow you to select more, and then you hit OK, and then that's going to make a selection for you. Another type of selection that I want to mention is here. Shortcut Q. So if you click Q, you need to go on the brush mode, shortcut B, and once you start drawing, it would make a selection for you. And the way this process works is by you painting that selection. So right now I have this red color, and the way this process works is by you painting that selection. So right now I have this red color, so I'm going to go and paint the selection that I want, right? So this is great if you have the pen, so you can paint exactly how the selection is. Another thing you can do is you can hit W and go with the magic wand selection, and then go here or click Q, and that's going to show you the selected area with colors. And then here's something that I really like to do with this tool, is that I can go to the corners and I can go to the brush and then paint the areas that are supposed to be not painted. So keep in mind that anything that is not selected is in red, and therefore you would imagine that this brush works ideally in black and white. So let's say you, for instance, have color red or color blue. This tool is not going to see them as color red or color blue. It's going to see them as shades, because this deals with the selection just like as if it's a mask. So therefore everything for that tool, for this one, is in the grayscale. So with that said, I'm going to hit D on the keyboard to reset these to the default, and then going to the other shortcut, which is clicking X on the keyboard to swap the foreground color with the background color, or A and B colors. See that swap, which is also the shortcut of this button actually. And now I'm going to paint with white, which means I'm going to be adding selection, right? So you can just reduce that brush with the left bracket, and you can just paint on those areas here. You can see that this one is not perfect, so I'm gonna hit X on the keyboard to flip those colors. let's say I made this mistake, whether intentionally or not, I can just go back and paint. And this is a process where it would be really great using the pen. And you can see here it's really nice because it shows you really vividly if you have missed something or if the colors themselves are kind of off that led to that kind of selection. And once you're done, you click Q again, and you can just say Control-Shift-J, and that's going to take that mountain away from you. You can see those little missing pieces here that I talked about, right? So the brush tool is really nice. It's a bit more on the manual side, which is great.